October 14, 1943. 27,000 feet above the German town of Schweinfurt, Captain Don Blakesley is doing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He's abandoning men to die. Not because he wants to, not because he's a coward, but because the mathematics of fuel consumption are as merciless as the German fighters circling below him. His P-47 Thunderbolt has 20 minutes of fuel remaining. 20 minutes before the engine coughs, sputters and dies, sending him spiraling into enemy territory or the cold waters of the North Sea. Below him, 316 B-17 flying fortresses are pushing deeper into Germany, attempting to destroy the ball-bearing factories that keep German tanks rolling and aircraft flying. Surrounding those bombers like wolves around a wounded elk, over 300 Luftwaffe fighters are methodically tearing the American formations to pieces. The bomber crews can see Blakesley's fighters turning away. They know what it means. They're on their own now, with 200 miles of German-controlled airspace between them and safety. Blakesley keys his radio one last time before banking toward England. His voice is tight with rage and frustration as he transmits words that will echo through every level of 8th Air Force Command. We need a fighter that can go all the way to Berlin and back. Until we get one, we're just feeding these boys into a meat grinder. What Captain Blakesley didn't know, what none of the Americans knew that day, was that the fighter he was begging for already existed. Not in some top-secret development program, not in the experimental workshops of some brilliant engineer, but sitting in a forgotten hangar at Wright Field, Ohio, gathering dust and paperwork, declaring it unsuitable for combat. The Army Air Force had tested this aircraft. They'd flown it, measured it, evaluated it, and rejected it as inadequate. Official reports stamped with government seals declared it inferior to existing American fighters. By every measure of bureaucratic wisdom and institutional knowledge, this aircraft was a failure, destined for the scrap heap of aviation history. But 5 months before Blakesley watched those bombers fly to their doom, something extraordinary happened. A man who wasn't a fighter pilot, wasn't an American, and wasn't authorized to make any decisions about American military aircraft, climbed into that rejected fighter and saw something everyone else had missed. His name was Ronald Harker. He was a 30-year-old mechanic and test pilot for Rolls-Royce, and on April 30th, 1943, he committed an act that his superiors would call gross insubordination, that violated every protocol of military chain of command, and that was technically illegal under the regulations governing aircraft evaluation and modification. He test flew an American fighter without permission. He wrote a report contradicting official American evaluations. He recommended modifications to a foreign military aircraft that he had absolutely no authority to suggest, and in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would transform the air war over Europe, save thousands of American lives, and create what many consider the greatest fighter aircraft ever built. This is the story of how one mechanic's illegal idea became America's deadliest fighter, how bureaucratic rejection became battlefield dominance, and how breaking the rules sometimes isn't just the right thing to do. It's the only thing that can save you from disaster. Let's back up and understand just how desperate the situation had become by the fall of 1943. The Allied strategy for defeating Nazi Germany relied on a simple but brutal concept: strategic bombing. American B-17 and B-24 bombers would fly deep into Germany during daylight hours, using the famous Norden bomb site to precisely destroy factories, refineries, rail yards, and other industrial targets. Unlike the British, who bombed at night and accepted lower accuracy in exchange for lower losses, the Americans insisted on daylight precision bombing. There was just one catastrophic problem with this strategy. German fighter aircraft were slaughtering the bomber formations. The numbers tell a story of systematic destruction. On August 17, 1943, a raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost the 8th Air Force 60 B-17s destroyed, and another 100 damaged so severely they'd never fly again. That's 600 trained aircrew killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th, the one Blakesley participated in, lost another 60 bombers. To understand how unsustainable these losses were, consider this. Bomber crews were required to complete 25 missions before rotating home. But if you're losing 10% of your bombers on each mission, the statistical probability of any individual crew surviving 25 missions is less than 8%. The bomber boys were doing the math. They knew they were dead men flying. The root cause was achingly simple. American fighters couldn't escort the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a magnificent aircraft in many ways, had the range of a sports car. It could escort bombers about 250 miles into Germany, provide cover for maybe 30 minutes of combat, then had to turn back or run out of fuel over enemy territory. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines, could reach a bit farther, maybe 300 miles. But the P-38 had its own problems. Its engines, superb in the warm climates of the Pacific, suffered chronic mechanical failures in the cold, damp weather over northern Europe. Coolant systems froze, engines seized. Pilots who survived combat often didn't survive the flight home as one engine after another failed in the frigid air. This created what military planners called the fighter gap. For roughly 200 to 400 miles of their mission, depending on the target, American bombers flew without any fighter protection at all. The Luftwaffe, understanding this perfectly, positioned their fighters accordingly. They'd wait until the American escorts turned back, then attack the bombers with overwhelming force. German fighter tactics evolved to exploit this vulnerability with brutal efficiency. They'd approach from head-on at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour, firing 20mm and 30mm cannon that could tear a B-17 apart with a single burst. They'd drop bombs from above, trying to break up the tight formations that gave bombers mutual defensive fire. They'd use rocket-armed fighters to attack from beyond the range of the bombers' 50-caliber machine guns. The bomber crews, brave beyond measure, did everything they could. They flew in tight formations so their overlapping fields of fire created a defensive barrier. They varied their altitudes and routes. They equipped some B-17s with extra guns, creating gunships that provided additional protection. None of it was enough. By October 1943, the crisis had reached a breaking point. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, was facing a decision that kept him awake at night. Either suspend daylight bombing until a solution could be found, or continue accepting losses that would eventually destroy the 8th Air Force as an effective fighting force. Suspending daylight bombing meant admitting the entire strategic doctrine was flawed. It meant telling the American public and the British allies that years of planning and billions of dollars of investment had produced a strategy that didn't work. It meant giving the Germans time to disperse their industry, harden their defenses, and possibly develop war-winning weapons like jet aircraft or atomic bombs. But continuing meant sending young men to die at rates that couldn't be sustained. It meant watching bomber groups that had arrived in England with dozens of aircraft reduced to a handful. It meant writing letters to mothers explaining that their sons died because America couldn't build a fighter with enough range to protect them. What neither Arnold nor Blakesley nor any American commander knew was that the solution existed. It had been rejected, dismissed, and forgotten. And it would take a mechanic violating every rule of military bureaucracy to resurrect it. The story of America's greatest fighter begins with one of the most audacious proposals in aviation history. In 1940, Britain was fighting alone against Nazi Germany. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain barely, but the victory had been enormously costly. Hurricanes and Spitfires were being shot down faster than British factories could replace them. Britain desperately needed more fighters, needed them immediately, and didn't have the industrial capacity to produce them quickly enough. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, a California-based aircraft manufacturer, with a straightforward request: begin license production of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighter. The P-40 wasn't exceptional, but it was available, proven, and adequately effective. Britain needed quantity more than quality. James Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, gave an answer that stunned the British representatives. He told them North American could design and build a completely new fighter, from scratch, in less time than it would take to set up P-40 production lines. The British thought he was insane. Designing a new fighter from scratch typically took 3 to 5 years. Production setup took another year. Kindleberger was claiming he could do both in 4 months. But Kindleberger wasn't bluffing. He had one of the most talented aircraft design teams in America, led by Chief Engineer Edgar Schmude, a German émigré who'd worked for Fokker before coming to America. Schmude had been studying modern fighter design for years, analyzing German, British, and American aircraft, identifying their strengths and weaknesses. When the British gave him 120 days to produce a prototype, Schmude already had many of the solutions worked out in his head. The aircraft that emerged from North American's design offices, designated NA-73X, was revolutionary in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for months. Schmude incorporated a laminar flow wing developed by NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Unlike conventional wings with maximum thickness near the front, the laminar flow wing had its thickest point farther back. This allowed air to flow smoothly over the wing surface without becoming turbulent, dramatically reducing drag. The fuselage was designed using mathematical calculations rather than the traditional approach of building what looked right and then refining it through testing. Schmude calculated the ideal aerodynamic shape, then designed the internal structure to match that shape rather than the other way around. The radiator placement was particularly ingenious. Instead of mounting it under the nose where it would create drag, Schmude positioned it behind the cockpit in a ventral scoop. The radiator used a principle called the Meredith effect, where heated air expanding in the radiator actually created thrust rather than drag. The system wasn't perfectly efficient, but it recovered much of the energy lost to cooling, making the radiator installation nearly drag neutral. The British designated the new fighter the Mustang, a name that captured its wild, untamed potential. The prototype flew on October 26, 1940, just 117 days after design work began. It had beaten the impossible deadline by 3 days. Initial flight testing revealed an aircraft with extraordinary potential. At low altitude, the Mustang was the fastest fighter anyone had ever flown, reaching 380 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. It handled beautifully, with light, responsive controls and excellent visibility. And its range, thanks to internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons plus provisions for external drop tanks, exceeded any existing single-engine fighter by a huge margin. The British ordered immediately, eventually purchasing over 600 Mustangs for the Royal Air Force. But there was a problem, a fundamental, crippling, career-ending problem that would nearly consign the Mustang to the dustbin of aviation history. The engine was terrible at high altitude. The Allison V1710 engine powering the Mustang used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. This was adequate for low and medium altitudes, where air density remained relatively high. But as altitude increased and air became thinner, the Allison couldn't compress enough air into the cylinders to maintain power. At 25,000 feet, where modern air combat typically occurred, the Mustang's performance collapsed catastrophically. Speed dropped below 300 miles per hour. Climb rate became anemic. Maneuverability suffered as the engine gasped for air like a drowning man. German fighters, designed for high-altitude combat with sophisticated turbo superchargers or multi-stage superchargers, operated comfortably at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. They could simply climb above the Mustangs, dive down with devastating energy advantage, fire a burst, then climb back to altitude where the Allison-powered aircraft couldn't follow. The RAF, recognizing these limitations, assigned Mustangs to low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Flying at 5,000 feet or below, photographing German positions or strafing truck convoys, the Mustang excelled. Its speed made it difficult to intercept, its range allowed it to penetrate deep into occupied territory, and its excellent handling made it stable for ground attack work. But it couldn't fight at altitude. And in 1942 and 1943, altitude was where the war was being won or lost. The U.S. Army Air Forces conducted their own evaluation of the Mustang and reached identical conclusions. The official report, filed in November 1942, stated, "The North American NA-73 demonstrates exceptional performance characteristics below 15,000 feet. Handling qualities are excellent. Range significantly exceeds all contemporary single-engine fighters. However, performance degradation above 15,000 feet renders the aircraft unsuitable for escort or air superiority missions against modern European fighters optimized for high-altitude combat. Recommend limited procurement for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles only. That evaluation, stamped and filed and distributed through the vast bureaucracy of the Army Air Forces, should have been the end of the Mustang's story. A promising design, crippled by an inadequate engine. Useful for secondary missions but unable to fulfill the critical requirement of the moment, long-range bomber escort. North American continued building Mustangs for British and limited American orders. The company made more money from its B-25 Mitchell bomber anyway. Edgar Schmood moved on to other projects. The Army Air Forces focused on the P-47 and P-38, accepting their limitations because they were the best available options. And then on April 30th, 1943, Ronald Harker decided to break the rules. Ronald Harker wasn't supposed to be evaluating fighters. That wasn't his job. He was a Rolls-Royce company test pilot and engine specialist stationed at the Hucknall facility in Nottinghamshire, England. His job involved testing new engine variants in various aircraft platforms and providing technical feedback to Rolls-Royce engineers working on performance improvements. He flew Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, Mosquitoes, and other British aircraft, equipped with Rolls-Royce engines. He had no authority to evaluate American fighters. He had no authorization to make recommendations about their deployment. He certainly had no right to suggest modifications to foreign military aircraft. On April 30th, Harker visited RAF Duxford to observe Mustang operations. The 26th Squadron was flying tactical reconnaissance missions, and Rolls-Royce wanted data on engine performance in operational conditions. Harker was there to collect information, nothing more. The squadron commander, discussing the Mustang's characteristics over lunch, mentioned casually that the aircraft was absolutely brilliant below 15,000 feet, but essentially useless above that altitude. The high-altitude performance was so poor that pilots avoided climbing if possible, even when doctrine suggested altitude was tactically advantageous. Then, in what seemed like a throwaway gesture, the commander offered Harker a chance to fly one of the Mustangs. Just a familiarization flight, nothing official. Harker was a test pilot. Pilots liked sharing their aircraft with other pilots. It was a routine courtesy extended between professionals. Harker climbed into the cockpit of Mustang AG-470, a Mark I model, and conducted what should have been a simple familiarization flight. But as he put the aircraft through its paces, something clicked in his engineering mind. The airframe was exceptional. The controls were perfectly balanced, requiring just the right amount of force. Not heavy like some British fighters, not light to the point of oversensitivity like some American aircraft. The aircraft was rock steady as a gun platform, but responsive in maneuvering. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent, better than a Spitfire's, with thin frames and a bubble canopy providing clear views in all directions. The aerodynamics were superb. Harker could feel how cleanly the aircraft slipped through the air. There was none of the slight buffeting or rough air that characterized less refined designs. The Mustang felt like it wanted to go fast, like speed was its natural state and anything slower required effort. Everything about the airframe was right. The handling was beautiful. The design was elegant. The engineering was sophisticated. Everything except the engine. Below 15,000 feet, the Allison V1710 performed adequately. Not spectacularly, but well enough. But as Harker climbed higher, conducting altitude performance tests, he felt the power fade away. At 20,000 feet, acceleration was noticeably sluggish. At 25,000 feet, the aircraft felt like it was wading through syrup. Harker knew engines. He'd spent years testing the Rolls-Royce Merlin, Britain's premier aero engine, in dozens of different aircraft and configurations. He understood intimately how the Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained power output as altitude increased. While other engines gasped at 25,000 feet, the Merlin was just getting started. As he flew AG-470 back to Duxford, a radical idea crystallized in Harker's mind. What if you took this magnificent airframe and married it to the Merlin engine? The combination would be devastating. The Mustang's low-altitude speed and range, combined with the Merlin's high-altitude power, The exceptional handling and visibility, combined with performance that could match or exceed any fighter in existence. It would be, Harker realized, the perfect fighter. After landing, Harker committed his act of bureaucratic rebellion, without authorization from Rolls-Royce management, without approval from RAF command, without permission from American authorities, and without any official standing to make recommendations about American aircraft. He sat down and wrote a detailed technical report, recommending that the Mustang be re-engined with the Rolls-Royce Merlin. His report, dated May 3, 1943, didn't hedge or qualify. It stated bluntly, "The Mustang airframe represents the finest aerodynamic and structural design currently in production. Its only significant limitation is the Allison engine's altitude performance. Installation of the Merlin 60 series engine would create an aircraft combining the Mustang's exceptional range and handling characteristics with the Merlin's high-altitude power. The resulting fighter would exceed the performance of any aircraft currently operational or in development. I strongly recommend immediate experimental testing of this configuration." Harker sent the report up his chain of command at Rolls-Royce, not really expecting much to come of it. Technical suggestions got buried in bureaucracy all the time. He'd made his recommendation. Whether anyone listened was beyond his control. What Harker didn't know was that his report would land on the desk of one of the few men in Britain with the authority, vision, and willingness to act on unauthorized recommendations from mechanics. Air Vice Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman read Harker's report and understood immediately that it might be the most important document to cross his desk all year. Freeman had the authority to authorize experimental modifications to RAF aircraft. He also had the political skills to navigate the delicate situation of telling the Americans they'd made a mistake in evaluating their own aircraft. Within days, Freeman had contacted the Ministry of Aircraft Production, forwarding Harker's report with a strong endorsement. Within weeks, Rolls-Royce engineers were being authorized to proceed with an experimental conversion. The bureaucratic wheels, normally slow to turn, were suddenly spinning fast, because by spring 1943, everyone with access to bomber loss statistics knew that the situation was approaching catastrophe, and when catastrophe looms, unauthorized recommendations from mechanics start looking like salvation. Converting the Mustang from Allison to Merlin power wasn't just a simple engine swap. It required significant engineering work, careful testing, and diplomatic navigation of American sensibilities. The Americans had evaluated the Mustang and rejected it for high-altitude missions. The British were now essentially saying that evaluation was wrong, that the Americans had missed something obvious. This risked offending an ally whose industrial capacity and military power were essential to winning the war. Freeman handled the diplomacy carefully. He contacted American authorities through official channels, suggesting that testing a Merlin-powered Mustang might provide valuable data for both nations. He emphasized that Rolls-Royce would handle all conversion work at British expense. He framed it as an experimental collaboration rather than a criticism of American evaluation procedures. The American response was lukewarm at best. A memorandum from Wright Field, the Army Air Force's testing center in Ohio, dated May 22nd, stated, "The RAF's suggestion regarding Merlin installation in the P-51 is noted. However, we have already committed substantial resources to the P-47 and P-38 programs for escort duties. Modifying an aircraft already evaluated as unsuitable for high-altitude air superiority work seems an inefficient allocation of engineering resources during wartime. We do not object to RAF experimental work, but cannot commit American resources to this program at present." Translation: do what you want, but don't expect us to care. But Freeman had a card to play that the Americans didn't know about. Rolls-Royce had already begun the conversion. Without formal approval, without official authorization, and without really caring whether anyone gave them permission, Rolls-Royce engineers at Hucknall had removed the Allison engine from Mustang Mark I serial number AL975 and begun fitting a Merlin 65. This was audacious, bordering on outrageous. The Mustang belonged to the Royal Air Force, purchased from America under Lend-Lease. Modifying it without consulting the manufacturer or the nation that built it violated numerous protocols and agreements. If the Americans objected, it could create a diplomatic incident, but Freeman gave tacit approval and the engineers proceeded. The conversion required months of work. The Merlin was physically larger than the Allison, requiring modifications to the engine mounts, structural reinforcement, and complete redesign of the cowling. The propeller had to be changed to accommodate the Merlin's different power characteristics and rotation direction. The cooling system needed substantial modification, with radiator ducts, fluid lines, and control systems all requiring engineering changes. The fuel system needed adjustment. The oil system was completely different. The engine controls were reorganized. Every interface between engine and airframe had to be carefully engineered. The project took 4 months. 4 months during which American bomber crews continued dying over Germany for lack of adequate fighter escort. 4 months during which official channels continued rejecting the Merlin Mustang concept as impractical. On October 13, 1943, the modified aircraft, designated Mustang Mark X, completed its first flight. Ronald Harker, the mechanic who'd started this entire chain of events, climbed into the cockpit. He lifted off from Hucknall, climbed to altitude, and prepared to discover whether his unauthorized recommendation had been brilliant insight or career-ending mistake. At 25,000 feet, Harker opened the throttle. The Merlin Mustang leaped forward with acceleration that literally shocked him. The speed built rapidly, far faster than any fighter Harker had flown. The aircraft sliced through the air with almost no drag, the clean aerodynamics combining with massive power to produce performance that seemed impossible. Harker glanced at the airspeed indicator. 430 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, 70 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at the same altitude, faster than a Spitfire Mark 9, faster than an FW-190, faster than anything except perhaps the latest German fighters, and even they couldn't match this speed, while also having the Mustang's range. The climb rate was spectacular. Harker pulled back on the stick and watched the altimeter wind up. The rate of climb that had been anemic with the Allison was now exceptional. The Merlin was maintaining power output all the way up, breathing easily in the thin air that had choked the Allison. Handling remained superb. If anything, the Merlin Mustang felt even more responsive than the Allison version. The additional power gave the aircraft energy for maneuvers that would have bled speed dangerously in the original version, and the range was unchanged. The Merlin consumed fuel at approximately the same rate as the Allison, meaning the Mustang's exceptional range carried over completely to the high-altitude capable version. Harker flew for 2 hours, testing every aspect of performance, pushing the aircraft through maneuvers, climbs, dives, and high-speed runs. Every test confirmed what he'd suspected. The Merlin Mustang was extraordinary. His flight test report, filed the next day, didn't contain technical hedging or bureaucratic qualification. It stated simply and directly, "The Merlin Mustang is the finest fighter aircraft I have ever flown at any altitude. Performance exceeds the Spitfire Mark 9 above 20,000 feet, while maintaining a range advantage of over 200%. Handling characteristics are excellent. This aircraft should be put into immediate production." Within days, RAF combat pilots were testing the Merlin Mustang and filing reports that confirmed everything Harker had said. Squadron leader Michael Robinson, a combat veteran with 12 confirmed kills, wrote, "I have flown Spitfires, Hurricanes, Typhoons, and American P-47s in combat. The Merlin Mustang is superior to all of them above 15,000 feet and equal to the best below. Most importantly, its range is triple that of the Spitfire. This is the bomber escort fighter we've desperately needed. If America can produce this aircraft in quantity, it will change the air war completely." The test data couldn't be ignored. By November 1943, performance reports were reaching American commanders who understood their implications immediately. General Henry "Hap" Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, was not a man who enjoyed admitting mistakes, but he was pragmatic enough to recognize when circumstances demanded changing course. The British test data showed a fighter with performance exceeding any American aircraft in service or development. Range of over 2,000 miles with drop tanks, speed of 442 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling of 40 miles 900 feet. Rate of climb of 3,475 feet per minute. These weren't projections or estimates. This was tested, verified performance from a flying aircraft. The combat radius numbers told the critical story. The Merlin Mustang could escort bombers 650 miles with internal fuel alone. With two 75-gallon drop tanks, combat radius extended to over 800 miles. Berlin was 550 miles from England. For the first time since America entered the war, the solution to the bomber escort crisis was sitting on the table. Arnold's response was immediate and unequivocal. On November 8, 1943, he sent a directive to North American Aviation: convert two P-51 airframes to Merlin configuration immediately using Packard-built engines, conduct full performance testing, report results directly to my office, highest priority. But North American was already ahead of him. While Rolls-Royce had been conducting its unauthorized conversion in England, North American engineers had been quietly working with Packard Motor Company, the American manufacturer licensed to build Merlin engines for British aircraft. Edgar Schmude, the Mustang's chief designer, had never been happy with the Allison engine. He'd designed the aircraft with sufficient internal volume and structural flexibility to accommodate different engines, anticipating that improvements might eventually be needed. When Packard approached North American in summer 1943 with samples of their Merlin production, Schmude immediately began design work on the conversion. The Packard Merlin V1650, built under license from Rolls-Royce, was essentially identical to the British version, but manufactured to American standards with American tooling and quality control. Packard was already producing thousands of Merlins monthly for export to Britain. Using Packard Merlins in American aircraft avoided the supply constraints that had initially concerned procurement officers. North American completed two prototype conversions, designated XP-51B and XP-51C, in November 1943. The company's chief test pilot, Robert Chilton, flew the first American-built Merlin Mustang on November 30th. His report confirmed the British results exactly. The aircraft was exceptional at all altitudes, with performance exceeding any American fighter in service or development. Chilton particularly praised the handling, noting that the Mustang was easier to fly than the P-47 while being significantly faster and longer ranged. Wright Field received the prototypes in early December for official testing. The engineers who'd previously rejected the Mustang as unsuitable for high-altitude missions now faced data they couldn't dismiss or ignore. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin Mustang was 41 miles per hour faster than the P-47 Thunderbolt and 56 miles per hour faster than the P-38 Lightning. It could outclimb both aircraft at all altitudes above 15,000 feet. Its range, even before considering external tanks, was 850 miles compared to the P-47's 475 miles and the P-38's 525 miles. The official test report, filed December 18, 1943, represented a complete reversal of the previous evaluation. The P-51B demonstrates exceptional performance characteristics at all altitudes. Speed, climb, and handling are superior to all current American fighter types. Range substantially exceeds requirements for bomber escort to any target in German-controlled territory. Recommend immediate maximum rate production and priority allocation to 8th Air Force units conducting bomber escort missions. General Arnold ordered full-scale production on December 20, 1943. Every available P-51 airframe would receive the Merlin engine. Allison-engined production would cease immediately. Production would be expanded as rapidly as possible. North American's Inglewood, California plant would build P-51Bs. A new factory in Dallas, Texas would build an identical version designated P-51C. By spring 1944, production would exceed 400 aircraft monthly. By summer, over 500 monthly. The transformation from rejected design to priority production had taken less than 8 months. From Harker's unauthorized test flight in April 1943 to Arnold's production order in December was just 234 days. One mechanic's illegal idea had become official policy, and the impact would be devastating to the Luftwaffe. The first P-51B Mustangs reached England in December 1943, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The pilots, transitioning from P-47 Thunderbolts, were initially skeptical. The Mustang looked small compared to the massive 7-ton Thunderbolt. It had only one engine versus the P-38's two, which made pilots nervous about flying over German territory where engine failure meant capture or death. Its 650 caliber machine guns seemed light compared to the P-47's 8. But their first combat mission on December 5, 1943, escorting bombers to Amiens, France, changed their minds completely. The Mustangs climbed to 25,000 feet faster than the bombers they were escorting. They cruised at speeds that allowed them to weave back and forth above the bomber formations, maintaining position easily while conserving fuel. And when Luftwaffe fighters appeared, the Mustangs dove on them with acceleration the Germans hadn't experienced from American fighters. Lieutenant Charles Gumm, flying his first Mustang combat mission, encountered two Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters attempting to attack the bombers from above. Gumm dove from 28,000 feet, reaching indicated airspeed over 500 miles per hour. The German pilots, seeing an American fighter diving at that speed, assumed it was a P-47 in a high-speed attack pass and expected it to zoom back to altitude after one firing pass, unable to follow them in maneuvering. Instead, Gumm stayed with them. Through turns, through climbs, through every evasive maneuver they attempted, the Mustang remained glued to their tails. Gumm destroyed both aircraft, then climbed back to bomber altitude with fuel reserves to spare. His combat report filed that evening captured the revelation. The P-51 does everything the P-47 does but stays with the bombers all the way home. Speed is exceptional. Handling is superb. Range is triple anything we've flown. This changes absolutely everything about bomber escort. By January 1944, multiple fighter groups were transitioning to Mustangs. The 357th Fighter Group received aircraft in February. The 4th Fighter Group, led by Don Blakesley, converted in March. Each group discovered the same truth. The Mustang wasn't just better at some things than other fighters. It was better at almost everything. The kill-to-loss ratios told the story quantitatively. In January and February 1944, P-51 units achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio against German fighters. The P-47, excellent in its own right, averaged 7-to-1. The P-38 managed 5-to-1. German pilots who'd learned to defeat P-47s and P-38s found the Mustang a completely different challenge. Major Günther Rall, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, encountered P-51s in March 1944 after transferring to Western defense. His after-action report provides insight into German perspectives. The new American fighter is superior to our Bf-109G and FW-190A models in almost every performance category. It is faster at all altitudes. It climbs better. It has superior range, allowing it to maintain combat power throughout engagements that would force our fighters to disengage for fuel. Handling appears exceptional, with American pilots conducting maneuvers that would be dangerous in our aircraft. The arrival of the P-51 in quantity transformed the strategic bombing campaign fundamentally. Before the Mustang, deep penetration raids into Germany were calculated gambles. Losses of 5 to 10% per mission were common. At those rates, statistical analysis showed that bomber crews had less than a 20% chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. The losses threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign entirely. With Mustang escort to and from targets, bomber losses dropped dramatically. The first Berlin raids in March 1944 saw losses under 4% despite facing the Luftwaffe's most experienced defensive units. The presence of Mustangs throughout the mission prevented the massed attacks that had previously devastated unescorted formations. But the Mustang's impact extended far beyond protecting bombers. General James Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, issued a directive that fundamentally changed fighter tactics. Previously, fighters had been required to stay close to bomber formations, reacting defensively to German attacks. Doolittle's new guidance stated, "Destroy the German Air Force wherever you find it, in the air or on the ground." The Mustang's range made this new approach possible. Fighter groups could sweep ahead of bomber formations, attacking German fighters before they could organize for massed attacks. They could break off to chase individual German aircraft, knowing they had fuel reserves to return to the bombers. and increasingly they could strafe German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could take off. The German response revealed the Mustang's impact clearly. A Luftwaffe tactical directive dated March 28, 1944, stated, "American escort fighters with very long range, identified as P-51 Mustang, are now accompanying bomber formations throughout their missions deep into Reich territory. These fighters demonstrate superior performance to our standard fighters above 6,000 meters. Pilots are instructed to avoid extended combat with P-51s when possible. Attack bombers quickly using superior armament, then disengage before escorts can respond." But disengaging from Mustangs was easier ordered than accomplished. The German fighters' only performance advantage was in diving speed, and even that was marginal. In climbs, turns, acceleration, and sustained combat, the Mustang was equal or superior. German pilots found that engaging bombers meant fighting through Mustang escorts, and fighting Mustangs was increasingly a losing proposition as American pilot quality improved through combat experience. The statistics from spring and summer 1944 demonstrated the transformation quantitatively. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 131 heavy bombers. In April, losses dropped to 70. In May, 61. In June, 42. By July and August, monthly losses were consistently below 50 aircraft, despite flying more missions than ever before. The declining bomber losses corresponded directly to increasing Mustang availability. As more fighter groups converted from P-47s and P-38s to P-51s, bomber losses declined while fighter victories increased. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed in a war of attrition it couldn't win. American industry produced fighters faster than Germany could replace losses. American training schools generated pilots faster than German schools could produce replacements, and the quality gap narrowed steadily as American pilots gained experience while German veterans died. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, saw Allied air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe fighters were almost entirely absent from the battlefield. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy on June 6, compared to over 14,000 Allied sorties. Mustangs patrolling at altitude ensured German fighters never reached the beaches in significant strength. By late summer 1944, Luftwaffe day fighter forces were effectively broken as a strategic force. They still existed, still flew occasional sorties, still sometimes achieved local tactical successes, but strategically, they'd lost. They couldn't defend German cities from daylight bombing. They couldn't support ground forces facing Allied advances. They couldn't replace losses at rates necessary to remain effective as a fighting force. The Mustang, the fighter that Army procurement had rejected as unsuitable, had become the weapon that achieved air superiority over Europe. The P-51 Mustang became the mount of choice for America's most successful fighter pilots in Europe. Major George Preddy achieved 26.83 aerial victories, the fractional kills representing shared credits, making him the top-scoring Mustang ace. Preddy was killed in December 1944 by friendly anti-aircraft fire during a low-altitude pursuit, a tragic irony for a pilot who'd survived dozens of combats against the Luftwaffe. Major John Meyer scored 24 kills flying P-51s. Colonel Francis Gabreski, who'd already achieved ace status flying P-47s, added 6.5 kills in Mustangs. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later become famous for breaking the sound barrier, achieved 11.5 victories in Mustangs, including 5 in a single day, October 12, 1944. The pilots loved the aircraft for reasons extending beyond raw performance statistics. The cockpit visibility was exceptional, with the bubble canopy providing 360-degree vision. This was crucial in combat, where seeing the enemy first often meant the difference between victory and death. The controls were light and responsive, making the aircraft agile in dogfights. It was stable as a gun platform, allowing precise aiming, but maneuverable enough to evade enemy fire. And it was forgiving. The Mustang tolerated pilot errors that would have killed pilots in less stable aircraft. It didn't snap into spins during aggressive maneuvering. It recovered gracefully from stalls. It handled smoothly throughout its entire speed range. Major George Preddy, in an interview just weeks before his death, described the Mustang's qualities. "It does everything well. It's fast, climbs strongly, turns tight, has range for hours of combat. But what makes it special is how it combines all these qualities simultaneously. Other fighters might match the Mustang in one category. The P-47 is more rugged, the Spitfire turns tighter at low altitude, but the Mustang is competitive in every category. You can't trap a competent Mustang pilot. He can always extend away if the fight turns unfavorable, then return when he has advantage. That versatility is what makes it deadly." The aircraft's reliability was another advantage rarely emphasized in performance comparisons, but crucial in sustained combat operations. The Packard Merlin engine was robust and maintainable. Mechanics could perform routine maintenance quickly, keeping aircraft operational even under the challenging conditions of forward airfields. The airframe was tough, regularly bringing pilots home despite battle damage that would have destroyed less robust designs. The systems included redundancies where possible, meaning single component failures rarely caused aircraft loss. Captain Donald Lopez, who completed 70 combat missions in Mustangs, described returning from a mission over Germany with 67 flak holes in his aircraft, including significant damage to one aileron and the rudder. "The plane flew like it was angry, controls were heavy and it wanted to turn left constantly, but it flew. It brought me home across 300 miles of German territory. Any other fighter would have been uncontrollable with that damage. The Mustang just absorbed it and kept flying." The P-51B and P-51C models that arrived in early 1944 were exceptional, but North American continued refining the design throughout the war. The most significant upgrade was the P-51D, which entered production in March 1944. The D model featured a bubble canopy replacing the original framed canopy, improving visibility even further. Armament increased from 4 to 6 50 caliber machine guns, providing heavier firepower. The gun sight was upgraded to the K-14 gyroscopic sight, which automatically calculated lead for deflection shooting. Various aerodynamic refinements increased top speed to 447 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The P-51D became the definitive Mustang variant. North American produced 9,123 D models, more than all other variants combined. It equipped the majority of 8th and 9th Air Force fighter groups by fall 1944 and dominated the skies over Europe in the war's final months. The final major variant, the P-51H, incorporated lessons from years of combat experience. Weight was reduced through using thinner wing skins, lighter structure, and removing unnecessary equipment. The engine was upgraded to a Packard Merlin V1650-9, producing 900 horsepower with water injection. Top speed reached 487 miles per hour, making it the fastest production Mustang ever built. But the H model arrived too late to significantly impact the war in Europe. Production began in February 1945, just months before Germany's surrender. Only 555 H models were built before war's end, and most never saw combat in Europe. The P-51H was primarily intended for the Pacific Theater and the planned invasion of Japan, operations that became unnecessary after the atomic bombs ended the war in August 1945. The P-51D remained the standard fighter through war's end in Europe. Its performance remained adequate to defeat any German aircraft in operational service, including the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter under certain circumstances. The Me-262, while faster in level flight and equipped with devastating 30mm cannon armament, was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its speed advantage disappeared. Mustang pilots learned to patrol German jet bases, catching Me-262s during these critical flight phases. The jet's speed advantage in the air was negated by the Mustang's ability to destroy them on the ground or during the slow, vulnerable moments of takeoff and initial climb. The production statistics for the P-51 Mustang reflect both its success and its importance to the Allied victory. Total production reached 15,575 aircraft across all variants. Of these, approximately 8,000 were P-51D models. Production peaked at 550 aircraft monthly in March 1945, maintained through the war's end. For comparison, Total P-47 Thunderbolt production was 15,683 aircraft, nearly identical to Mustang production, despite the P-47 entering service 2 years earlier. P-38 Lightning production totaled 10,037 aircraft. The combat record was equally impressive. P-51 units claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Additionally, they destroyed approximately 4,131 enemy aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks. The combined total of nearly 9,100 enemy aircraft destroyed exceeded the claims of any other American fighter type. The loss rates tell another part of the story. Of 15,575 Mustangs produced, approximately 2,520 were lost in combat, a loss rate of 16.2%. This was significantly lower than other fighter types. The P-47 lost approximately 3,499 of 15,683 produced, a 22.3% loss rate. The P-38 lost approximately 1,558 of 10,037 produced, a 17.5% loss rate. The Mustang's lower loss rate reflected multiple factors: its performance advantages, the progressive weakening of German defenses as the war continued, and the fact that many Mustangs were produced late in the war when German resistance was collapsing. But it also demonstrated that the aircraft was survivable in combat, bringing pilots home despite damage and fierce opposition. The P-51 Mustang service didn't end with World War II. It fought extensively in Korea starting in 1950, where it excelled in ground attack roles supporting United Nations forces. While jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre handled air-to-air combat against MiG-15s, Mustangs attacked ground targets with devastating effectiveness. The combination of long-range, heavy ordnance capacity and excellent low-altitude handling made it ideal for close air support missions. Many air forces worldwide operated Mustangs through the 1950s and even into the 1960s. Israel flew Mustangs during its War of Independence in 1948 and subsequent conflicts. The Dominican Republic used Mustangs until the 1980s. Several Latin American air forces operated them for decades. The Mustang also enjoyed a second life in civilian hands. Surplus aircraft were sold after the war, and many found use in air racing. Heavily modified Mustangs dominated unlimited air racing for decades, with the basic airframe proving capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour with upgraded engines and aerodynamic refinements. Today, over 150 Mustangs remain airworthy worldwide, regularly appearing at air shows where they thrill crowds with their distinctive sound and graceful aerobatics. They serve as flying reminders of engineering excellence and historical significance. But the P-51 Mustang's true legacy extends beyond its combat record or its continued popularity among aviation enthusiasts. The Mustang represents several crucial lessons about innovation, engineering, and institutional decision-making. First, it demonstrates the power of combining existing technologies in innovative ways. Neither the Mustang airframe nor the Merlin engine was particularly revolutionary individually. The airframe was well designed, but used conventional materials and construction methods. The Merlin engine was excellent, but was already in widespread use. The revolutionary aspect was combining these two existing technologies in a way nobody had initially considered. Second, it illustrates how institutional evaluation processes can miss crucial possibilities. The Army Air Forces tested the original Allison-powered Mustang and correctly identified its high-altitude performance limitations. But their conclusion, that the aircraft was therefore unsuitable for critical missions, missed the possibility that the limitation could be corrected. They evaluated what existed rather than imagining what could exist with modifications. De-exist with modifications. Third, it shows that sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected sources. Ronald Harker wasn't a fighter pilot. He wasn't an American military officer. He wasn't part of any official procurement process. He was a mechanic and test pilot who happened to fly the right aircraft at the right moment and recognized a possibility that trained fighter pilots and military planners had overlooked. Fourth, it proves that challenging institutional wisdom, even at personal and professional risk, can produce results that benefit everyone. Harker's unauthorized test flight and report violated protocols. Freeman's decision to proceed with conversion without American approval risked diplomatic complications. Both men prioritized solving the problem over following proper procedures. And finally, it demonstrates that bureaucratic rejection doesn't necessarily mean an idea lacks merit. The Mustang was officially evaluated and rejected. That evaluation was filed, distributed, and became institutional knowledge throughout the Army Air Forces. Overcoming that institutional verdict required overwhelming evidence and willingness to admit previous evaluations had been incomplete. The story of the P-51 Mustang is ultimately a story about people making decisions under pressure. Don Blakesley, watching bombers fly unescorted into German fighter defenses, transmitted his desperate plea for better fighters. His words carried the weight of watching young men die for lack of adequate tools. Ronald Harker, recognizing potential in an aircraft others had dismissed, violated protocol to write a report recommending modifications he had no authority to suggest. His decision required confidence in his own technical judgment against institutional evaluations. Wilfred Freeman, receiving an unauthorized report from a mechanic, chose to act on it, despite diplomatic risks and bureaucratic complications. His decision required willingness to challenge American evaluations and potentially offend crucial allies. Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, faced with mounting bomber losses and a potential solution that required admitting previous evaluations were wrong, chose results over pride. His decision reversed institutional policy and committed enormous resources to an aircraft previously rejected. Edgar Schmood, who designed the Mustang airframe with flexibility to accommodate engine changes, had anticipated future improvements even when procurement officers saw only current limitations. His foresight enabled rapid conversion when the opportunity arose. Each of these men made decisions that violated normal procedures, challenged conventional wisdom, or required admitting previous mistakes. And collectively, their decisions created the fighter that won air superiority over Europe. Don Blakesley, who'd pleaded for long-range fighters after Schweinfurt, led the 4th Fighter Group flying Mustangs through the war's end. He personally achieved 15.5 confirmed aerial victories, but his real achievement was leading his group to over 580 enemy aircraft destroyed, making the 4th Fighter Group the highest-scoring unit in the 8th Air Force. In a post-war interview conducted in 1946, Blakesley reflected on the Mustang's impact with characteristic directness. "We always had courage. We always had numbers. We had industrial capacity beyond anything Germany could match, but we didn't have the right tool to do the job until the Mustang arrived. Before that, we were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Our fighters could escort bombers part way, then had to turn back and leave them to die. The bomber crews knew it. We knew it. The Germans knew it. Once we got the Mustang, everything changed almost overnight. We went from barely surviving missions to dominating the sky completely. The Mustang didn't just protect bombers, it hunted German fighters wherever they were and destroyed them. On the ground, in the air, at their bases, in transit. It was the fighter we desperately needed, delivered just in time to matter. The transformation from rejected design to war-winning weapon occurred with remarkable speed. From Harker's unauthorized test flight in April 1943 to Mustangs dominating German skies in spring 1944 was barely 12 months. In that single year, one mechanic's illegal idea became validated engineering, bureaucratic rejection became enthusiastic acceptance, and a dismissed aircraft became the deadliest American fighter of World War II. The Mustang's impact is perhaps best understood through German accounts. General Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The appearance of the Mustang over Germany spelled the end of the Jagdwaffe as an effective fighting force. We had adapted to the P-47 and P-38, learned their limitations, developed tactics to exploit their weaknesses. But the Mustang had no significant weaknesses we could exploit systematically. It was faster than our fighters, had equal or better maneuverability, and most crucially, it never had to leave. The psychological impact on our pilots was devastating. They knew that engaging the bombers meant fighting through Mustang escorts, and fighting Mustangs was almost certainly fatal for any but the most experienced pilots. We were losing our veterans faster than combat attrition alone could account for, because the Mustang forced continuous combat without respite. Franz Weber, a Luftwaffe pilot who survived the war, described the experience of facing Mustangs in early 1945. By then, we knew the war was lost, but the American Mustangs made it impossible to ignore. They were everywhere, all the time, at every altitude. They attacked our airfields at dawn, strafed our convoys during the day, shot down what few aircraft we could still get airborne. The sky belonged to them completely. When I saw Mustangs overhead, silver aircraft gleaming in the sun, I knew I was witnessing the end of the Luftwaffe. They were beautiful aircraft that represented everything we'd lost: technical excellence, industrial capacity, and most importantly, the ability to innovate and adapt faster than we could respond. One of the most sobering aspects of the Mustang story is considering what didn't happen. What if Ronald Harker had followed proper protocol and not written his unauthorized report? What if Wilfred Freeman had dismissed the report as outside proper channels? What if Rolls-Royce had waited for official approval before beginning the conversion? What if Hap Arnold had refused to admit previous evaluations were incomplete? The Merlin Mustang conversion would likely have happened eventually. The need was too desperate, the solution too obvious in retrospect, but eventually might have meant late 1944 or even 1945. It might have meant thousands of additional bomber crewmen killed over Germany. It might have meant the strategic bombing campaign suspended or curtailed, potentially extending the war months or even years. The human cost of bureaucratic delay in wartime is measured in lives. Every month the Mustang arrived earlier meant bombers' losses avoided, air crew saved, missions completed that otherwise would have failed. The fact that the Mustang entered service in early 1944 rather than late 1944 probably saved thousands of American lives and shortened the war by helping achieve air superiority months earlier. This raises uncomfortable questions about how many other potentially war-winning innovations were delayed or prevented by bureaucratic processes prioritizing procedure over results. How many rejected designs contained possibilities that were never explored? How many unauthorized insights from mechanics, technicians, and junior officers were ignored because they came from outside official channels? The P-51 Mustang story offers lessons that extend far beyond aviation history or World War II. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The breakthrough insight didn't come from fighter pilots, procurement officers, or military planners. It came from a mechanic who understood engines and recognized that an excellent airframe was crippled by an inadequate power plant. Organizations that dismiss ideas based on the source rather than the merit risk missing crucial innovations. Bureaucratic evaluation processes can be systematically wrong. The Army Air Forces tested the Mustang using appropriate procedures, reached logical conclusions based on the data, and made a decision that appeared correct at the time. But their process evaluated what existed rather than what could exist with modifications. Rigid adherence to existing evaluation frameworks can miss possibilities that fall outside standard categories. Sometimes breaking the rules is not just acceptable, it's necessary. Harker violated protocol. Freeman proceeded without proper authorization. Both men prioritized solving the problem over following procedures. Their willingness to accept personal and professional risk to pursue what they believed was right produced results that benefit everyone. Institutional inertia is powerful and dangerous. Once the Army Air Forces had officially evaluated and rejected the Mustang, that decision became institutional knowledge. Overcoming it required overwhelming evidence and high-level intervention. Organizations must remain open to reconsidering decisions when new information or perspectives emerge. The best solution often involves combining existing technologies in innovative ways, rather than developing entirely new technologies. The Merlin Mustang wasn't revolutionary technology. It was excellent existing technologies combined in a way nobody had initially considered. Innovation doesn't always mean invention. Sometimes it means seeing possibilities others have missed in what already exists. Today, when a restored P-51 Mustang performs at an air show, spectators hear the distinctive sound of the Merlin engine, a deep, powerful roar that aviation enthusiasts can identify instantly. They see the graceful lines of Edgar Schmude's design, the sleek fuselage and elegant wing that made the Mustang one of the most beautiful fighters ever built. But what they're really witnessing is the legacy of one mechanic's unauthorized test flight, the validation of a technically illegal recommendation, and proof that sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from people willing to challenge institutional wisdom in service of a greater truth. The P-51 Mustang was born from desperation, rejected by bureaucracy, saved by a mechanic who broke the rules, and ultimately became the fighter that helped win World War II by achieving what everyone said was impossible, escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, while destroying every German fighter foolish enough to challenge it. Ronald Harker's unauthorized flight on April 30th, 1943, lasted about an hour. That single hour, that one violation of protocol, that illegal recommendation, changed the course of the war and saved thousands of lives. The mechanic was right. The bureaucrats were wrong, and history was changed by one man's willingness to trust his own judgment over institutional evaluation, to violate rules in pursuit of a solution, and to accept professional risk to do what he believed was necessary. In the final analysis, the P-51 Mustang proves a truth that extends far beyond aviation, that sometimes the most important victories come not from following the rules, but from having the courage to break them when the rules are preventing the right solution from emerging. That the best ideas don't always come from the top of organizational charts. That bureaucratic rejection is not the same as actual failure. And that one person, in the right place at the right time, willing to trust their judgment over institutional wisdom, can change the world. The P-51 Mustang remains not just a great fighter aircraft, but a symbol of what becomes possible when innovation triumphs over bureaucracy, when individuals challenge institutions, and when doing the right thing matters more than following the proper procedure. And it all started with a mechanic who wasn't supposed to be evaluating fighters, flying an aircraft he wasn't authorized to test, writing a report he had no right to submit, recommending modifications that violated every protocol. Sometimes breaking every rule is exactly what victory requires,